Hey everyone, it's AJ from Pixelize, and today I want to cover closures and callbacks in PHP. So, explain it to you and show you a real world example as well. So this is just a PowerPoint. It's not point me going into the code because you might get confused if you don't fully understand it. So I just got some screenshots over to show you. So by the end of this, you will understand what closures are and how they work, how closures remember variables, the difference between callbacks and closures, how closures are used in middleware, because it's very heavy used, I would say, due to their flexibility and capabilities, right? Now, what is a closure? A closure in PHP is simply an anonymous function that can be captured and use variables from its surrounding scope even after the parent function has finished executing. Think of it as a function that remembers where it came from. PHP closures are slightly different than JavaScript closures or other closures because there's slightly different similarities into it. So basic example, closure that remembers a variable. So counter function is the parent function, which would be a global scope. Even though the count variable is a local variable for the counter, we have another function that returns, the parent function returns a child function, and we have this keyword use, and then we got count variable, and then we increment the count variable and return this. So what's happening here is this becomes a global scope and this becomes a local scope, and to use a global scope, to use a variable from a global scope, we have to use the keyword use to be able to use it. Now the ampersand is for reference. So what we can do with this is basically we reference whatever the value this becomes, and we, by putting the ampersand, we're able to change it. If this was 5 and we didn't have ampersand and we only increment, every time we call it will be 666, right? But because we are referencing to the main one, we obviously making changes to a modifier. So we go 1, 2, and 3 because it starts from 0. So what's happening is this: we declare the variable in a parent function. In the parent function, then we want to return another function which becomes a closure. We use the keyword use, we reference the count variable, then we increment the count and return the count. So then it could be modified. And as you can see here, we have the counter parent assigned to a variable which we call in, but it's not used, so that we get a closure function. Now every time we call increment, you need to remember we got another function here, we increment the count of whatever that is. So it starts from 0, we increment, it becomes 1. Because we reference this, it's modified, this is always going to be now 1. Increment again becomes 2, then becomes 3. So what it is basically, in other words, the function counter returns a closure, an anonymous function. Secondly, the closure captures the count variable from its parent function. Thirdly, even after the counter function has finished executing, increment function still has access to the count. Every time we call the increment, the value of a count persists and updates. This is one of the key features of closures. They remember state across function calls. It's because basically they are saved in a memory with a specific label when they've been declared. If you got a primitive value, it won't be, but in closures they will. Now, callback functions versus closures. A lot of people get confused by this. There's a slight difference in them. Let's talk about the callback functions, which are often confused with closures. Callback function is simply a function passed as an argument to another function and executed later. So we got this function called process data. It takes 2 parameters. It says echo processing, whatever we pass here, and then we call a function. You could name this whatever you want, next, func, or whatever, Bob, and call it here, doesn't matter. The point is, it takes some sort of data and then calls the function back. So we got process data, we pass the user data as a string, so it's going to be says processing user data, then we call back a function using, so we pass the function anonymous function in this point because it's not named, or it's not an arrow function, it's just anonymous function, a function with our name. Below it we will echo down done processing because we got break line here. So that's what callback function is. Basically, if you have a, let's say, an array and you use a map array or array filter, you will pass the array, which would be the data, and then you will use a callback function. So whatever the logic is in here, you could pass each individual item into the callback, and that callback will do the logic. Right? That's what it is. A function calling another function. Now, in a real world example, middleware processing, right? Middleware is a way to filter or modify a HTTP request before it reaches the controller. For example, Laravel has an authentication middleware that checks if a user is logged in before allowing them to access a route. To handle middleware efficiently, we use closures to wrap function calls inside another function. Now, Laravel, I wouldn't touch it if you don't know the basic of PHP. If you know the basic of PHP, OOP, and the concept how things work, then go for Laravel, because Laravel is built on OOP and uses the concept like closures, dependency injection, contract service providers, and so on. So I wouldn't jump into a framework until you learn the basic language of that framework. Now, real world example, middleware processing. So this is what it looks like. I'll give you the visual representation here. So we have a variable action and assign a function to it, anonymous, which becomes a closure. In this function, we have a auth middleware using a method process that will pass another function. In that function, we have a session middleware that calls the process method, passes another function, and inside the function, we have a controller instance calling the action and pass parameters if you have any. So, in a nutshell, let's break this down. Middleware is like a pipeline. First, authentication checks if the user is logged in. Okay, so we check here. So the process does the logic. Then a session middleware ensures session data is variable. So once the process is done and it's validated, it says next. So uses the sort of callback, right? And I'll show you that in a sec. Then we will follow this, whatever the logic is. And finally, the controller executes everything is valid, if it's valid, right? So we check if everything's valid and off. If it is, we'll move on to session. Then we'll move on in a controller instance. Now, each middleware wraps the next function inside the closure. Auth middleware process runs first. Inside there we have a session middleware process runs it. It's called. Then the final function, we have a controller instance function and the params. So the params is basically like an ID, Slack, whatever you wanna. You get from the get post and all them stuff from the URL, right? Executes only after all middleware is completed. So this is what it looks like. You have a class of middleware. So this would be a service and implements a middleware interface, which will be a contract. You declare a method in a contract, which you call process. That process takes a closure. The logic doesn't happen in a contract, it happens in a service, because the contract is what it does, and the service is how it does it. So once we do the logic, whatever is here and is valid, we call the next, which in this case would be session middleware. So once that is done, then the session middleware implements a middleware. Again, we do the logic. Once it's done, we call the next one, which would be a controller. And then the controller executes, which shows you the view, because we're using an MVC pattern here, right? So it calls this first, second, and lastly this. So what goes first in goes out last. What goes out last in goes out first. It's how the stack works. So just to show you, this is a example array. Ignore this because there's a mistake I done in there. I was just copying and pasting it. Basically, it should be a comma, not semicolon. But you can see this will be called last, this will be called first. because it's last one in, first one out. So what we do is we use a loop. We assign a variable. So we got action in there. We have a arrow function to simply do one line statement there. So we have a controller instance. So this function will call the controller instance function with parameters. When this is executed, we merge all the routes middlewares and the global middlewares into all middleware array. We loop them over and take each middleware out. So each of them, start from the bottom. First of all, we check if the middleware can be instantiated through a construct. If it has got a constructor and dependency injection, if it does, we go through resolve. If it doesn't, we just call it. And then we are reassigning it. It might look like it's overwriting it, which it does technically, but how it works is because this is a closure, it saves this in the memory. Okay, once that is saved in the memory, it passes to the process. So it will look like this, right? So it builds up. So this will be a session. So this was the action. This action was passed in a variable of action into process. And this session then was later saved in an action variable, passed into a process as an action variable. So every time it loops over each of them, they get saved into a new memory, and the script remembers this. The execution code, the stack, remembers every time it's been declared, but it comes back with a new ID of it, you could call it. Right, so we got the session, we got the authentication, validation, whatever we got here, Flash middleware, template data, SRF, token middleware. So what happens is that every time we loop over them, we assign them into this function, and whatever was previously, it gets passed first and then it's saved in the memory. Once everything is basically built up as a chain, which would look like this in a more visual representation, this is a chain. In JavaScript it's called callback, but it's a chain of functions calling another functions within the function. Then we execute this, and basically it does the checks once before the request is done and after the request. So that's how the closures work. So closures remember variables from the origin scope. Middleware heavily relies on closures for the structured execution, and you can use closure for dynamic function execution to improve flexibility. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of a closure. This is how typically will look like. If you're not familiar with this is what I mean. Learn the basics before you jump into framework. This is the visual representation of chaining the callbacks. The one thing I would say, don't try to overthink it, is basically once there's a function assigned, it saves the function and then it can be executed later down the line because it remembers its state. But if you all of a sudden override the action with a primitive value like an integer, string, or something else, it will get rid of the closure. So make sure you don't override that, because otherwise you might have an error. Hopefully this helps, and I will see you on the next one.